3 times. The United States shut this route down 3 separate times. 3 different administrations, 3 different sets of sanctions, 3 separate press conferences where someone stood behind a podium and used the word unprecedented. The chip still made it to Shenzhen anyway. That's not a failure of intelligence. Washington knows exactly where these chips go. Customs officials in Singapore can probably draw you the route from memory at this point. And yet, quarter after quarter, the same corridor keeps moving the same restricted hardware, and nobody involved in stopping it seems able to actually stop it. Here's why that should bother you more than a simple smuggling story would. This isn't a handful of guys in a warehouse dodging paperwork. Singapore is the 4th largest trading partner the U.S. has in semiconductors, according to the Semiconductor Industry Association's 2025 trade figures. It's not a black market backwater. It's one of the most heavily audited logistics hubs on the planet, home to Broadcom's regional operations, Micron's assembly plants, and roughly a third of all Nvidia GPU revenue that touches Southeast Asia, based on Nvidia's own regional filings. You cannot sanction Singapore. You can barely inspect it without slowing down half of Asia's electronics supply chain. So the chips don't sneak past customs. They walk through it, legally. And something happens after that. Something the Commerce Department has tried to legislate against 3 separate times, in 2022, in late 2023, and again with the tightened end-user rules in 2025. Each time, the paperwork trail got a little cleaner, the shell layer got a little thicker, and the actual delivery method barely had to change. I want to be upfront about something before I go further. This isn't a story about Singapore being complicit. Most of what happens there is legal, on paper, at every step. That's the part that makes this genuinely difficult to write about and genuinely difficult to prosecute. There's no single crime scene. There's a structure. The thread I want to pull on is what happened in April 2025 when Nvidia disclosed something unusual in an SEC filing, a $5.5 billion charge tied specifically to H20 chip inventory that couldn't be shipped under new export controls. Buried in the same reporting period, Singapore accounted for roughly 22% of Nvidia's reported regional revenue, despite having a domestic AI compute market a fraction of that size. Somebody was buying a lot of chips that weren't staying in Singapore. That number is the thing I want you to hold on to. We'll come back to exactly where it went and why the destination on paper and the destination in practice turned out to be 2 very different addresses. Because here's the part that's almost funny. In the way a fire alarm going off in an empty building is funny, every crackdown assumed the same failure point. Every one of them targeted the seller, and every one of them left the buyer's side of the transaction almost completely untouched. So how does a restricted Nvidia H20, or its throttled cousin, the H20, actually get from a loading dock in Singapore to a data center in Shenzhen without anyone technically breaking the law at the point of sale? The mechanism is almost boringly simple, which is exactly why it survived 3 rounds of tightening. It starts with the paperwork concept known as the end-user statement, a document a buyer signs promising the hardware will be used where they say it'll be used. Under the Bureau of Industry and Securities rules, that statement is legally binding at the moment of sale. What it can't do is follow the chip after the sale closes. Once that box clears customs and changes hands, the compliance obligation effectively evaporates unless someone is actively watching the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th transactions downstream. Almost nobody is. This is where the shell layer comes in, and it's worth naming specifically rather than gesturing at vaguely. Reuters reported in 2024 on a network of Singapore-registered trading companies, small operations, often just a handful of employees, purchasing GPUs in volumes that made no sense for their stated business size. One firm profiled in that reporting had listed capital of a few $100,000 and was moving hardware orders worth tens of millions. That's not a company. That's a mail slot with a bank account. The chips get re-invoiced, sometimes multiple times, moving through Malaysia or Hong Kong as intermediate stops, not because those stops add value, but because they add distance. Distance between the original end-user statement and the final delivery address. By the time a shipment reaches its actual destination, the legal chain of custody has passed through enough hands that proving intent, which is what U.S. export law actually requires for criminal prosecution, becomes close to impossible. Here's the mechanism in one sentence. If you want the whole thing distilled, the law regulates the sale, but the smuggling happens after the sale, and almost every enforcement dollar gets spent on the part that's already legal. I promised I'd come back to that Nvidia number from part 1, the 22% of regional revenue flowing through a market too small to absorb it. Financial Times reporting from mid-2025 traced a portion of that volume through exactly this kind of shell structure, with hardware rerouted through Singaporean intermediaries before surfacing in mainland Chinese cloud computing listings weeks later. Nvidia isn't accused of knowing where every chip ends up. And legally, once the sale clears with a valid end-user statement, that's largely not their problem anymore. Which is, if you sit with it for a second, a genuinely strange feature of how this entire system is built. The company selling billions of dollars of the most geopolitically sensitive hardware on Earth bears almost no downstream liability for where it lands. The 2022 crackdown targeted direct sales to Chinese entities. It worked, narrowly, for exactly that channel. The 2023 rules added end-use certification requirements. Shell companies adapted within months. The 2025 tightening went after specific chip models by name, H20 included, closing the exact loophole Nvidia had built the H20 to exploit in the first place. And still, according to Semiconductor Industry Association trade data through early 2026, Singapore's chip re-export volume to third countries hadn't meaningfully dropped. It had just gotten harder to trace. 3 crackdowns. Same result each time. The seller gets more careful and the buyer barely notices. Here's where I have to complicate my own argument, because the easy version of this story, shell companies beat sanctions, isn't quite honest enough to stand on its own. The uncomfortable truth is that some of this isn't evasion at all. It's arbitrage of a gap that Washington built into the rules on purpose. The H20 chip I mentioned in Part 2 wasn't smuggled hardware to begin with. It was Nvidia's own compliant product, deliberately engineered with reduced interconnect bandwidth, specifically so it would fall under the export threshold and could be sold to China legally. The Commerce Department set the performance ceiling. Nvidia designed a chip that sat just under it. That's not a crackdown failing. That's a crackdown working exactly as written, producing an outcome nobody in Washington actually wanted. So when people say the smuggling route survived 3 crackdowns, I want to push back gently on my own framing. 2 of the 3 rounds weren't fully evaded. They were legally satisfied by a product built to satisfy them. And the actual controversy is whether that product should have been legal in the first place. Only the 3rd round, the 2025 tightening that named the H20 directly, forced the shell company mechanism from Part 2 to actually do real work. Before that, a meaningful share of the flow didn't need shell companies. It just needed a compliant SKU. That's the reversal, and it changes how you should read the whole story. This was never purely a smuggling problem. It was partly a design around the rule problem, and only became a full smuggling problem once Nvidia ran out of room to design around anything. Now, the harder data. A Center for Strategic and International Studies analysis published in late 2025 estimated that even after the H20 specific ban, somewhere between 15 and 25% of restricted tier AI chips reaching Chinese cloud providers were still arriving via Southeast Asian intermediary routes, Singapore chief among them, with Malaysia's data center boom absorbing a growing share of the same pattern. That's not a rounding error. In human terms, for every 4 export-controlled chips Washington believes it successfully blocked, roughly 1 is still getting through the exact route it just spent 3 years trying to close. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle anyone who thinks the next crackdown will finally fix this. Malaysia's Johor Bahru region, right across the causeway from Singapore, has seen data center construction triple since 2023, according to Knight Frank's regional real estate reporting. Some of that is legitimate cloud infrastructure demand. Some of it, per the same CSIS analysis, functions as a second hop. Chips landing in Malaysian facilities that lease compute access back to Chinese firms remotely, meaning the hardware itself never has to cross a border a second time. It just has to be reachable. I'll admit the thing I'm least certain about here, whether that Malaysian compute leasing model is actually illegal under current export law or whether it's another H20 style gap, technically compliant, strategically catastrophic. My read of the BIS guidance suggests it's closer to the second. Nobody's broken a law renting out a server rack to a paying customer. They've just found the fourth version of the same trick. 3 crackdowns closed 3 doors. The building had more doors than anyone at Commerce had bothered to count. So let's bring this back together, because I think the real story here got buried under 3 separate news cycles that each treated their crackdown as the final word. The route from Singapore to Shenzhen didn't survive because enforcement was lazy, or because some brilliant smuggling network outsmarted the US government at every turn. It survived because the thing being regulated, a legal sale to a legal buyer of a product engineered to sit just inside the legal threshold, kept mutating one step ahead of whatever definition Washington had just finished writing. First, it was the H20's bandwidth ceiling. Then it was the shell company's paperwork. Now it's a server rack in Johor Bahru that nobody has to physically move again. Here's my honest take. I don't think this gets solved by a 4th crackdown aimed at a 4th loophole. I think the entire enforcement model is built on a false assumption that you can regulate a chip the way you regulate a controlled substance, by tracking a physical object across a border. But compute isn't really the physical object anymore. It's access. And access can be sold from a data center that never technically ships anything anywhere. My prediction, and I'll put my name on this one, the next major enforcement action won't target a chip model or an end-user statement at all. It'll target remote compute access directly, something closer to how the US already treats cloud service exports under existing ITAR-adjacent frameworks. Because until that happens, you can ban every chip by name, and the workaround will just move one layer up the stack, from hardware to access, exactly the way it already has once. Remember that 22% figure from Part 1? Nvidia's outsized Singapore revenue against a domestic market that couldn't possibly absorb it? That number was never really about Singapore. It was the visible symptom of a system where the point of sale and the point of use had already quietly become 2 different questions, answerable by 2 different sets of rules. 3 crackdowns tried to close the gap between those 2 questions. 3 crackdowns answered the wrong one. The chips still made it to Shenzhen. They probably still are. If this kind of thing is worth tracking closely, stick around. There's more of this route left to map.